Hi there, and welcome to Bedtime History. If you enjoy relaxing stories about incredible people from the past, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring you more peaceful, fascinating tales to fall asleep to. Now, let's get comfortable, take a deep breath, and travel back in time. Tonight's story is about a man whose life was more adventurous than any novel, and his son ended up writing some of the greatest novels of all time. This is the true story of General Thomas Alexandre Dumas. Thomas Alexandre Dumas was born in 1762 in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, on the western half of the island that is today called Haiti. His birth was unusual, not just for the time, but for what it symbolized. His father, a French nobleman named Alexandre Antoine David de la Pailletterie, was a white aristocrat. His mother, Marie Cécette Dumas, was a black enslaved woman. Their relationship was not one of equals, and while some historical records try to soften the reality, it's likely that Marie Cécette had very little choice in the matter. Still, from this complicated and painful beginning, a remarkable life began. Thomas Alexandre was raised as a slave until he was about 12 years old. At that point, his father made a decision that would change both of their lives. He sold all of his other children and returned to France with Thomas Alexandre. Once in France, slavery was not legal, and Thomas Alexandre was, on paper, a free boy. His father raised him in relative comfort, giving him the training of a young aristocrat. He learned to read and write, to ride horses, and most importantly, to fight. It turned out he had a gift for it. When he was a teenager, Thomas Alexandre made a decision that surprised many. He rejected his father's noble name and instead adopted the name Dumas, after his mother. This choice said a lot about the young man's sense of identity and justice. He would never forget where he came from, even as he climbed to the highest ranks of French society. At the age of 24, he enlisted in the French army as a private soldier. But his rise was fast and furious. Within just a few years, he became a general, the highest-ranking man of African descent ever in a European army. He was not just promoted because of his background. He earned it through his astonishing bravery and tactical skill. One of the most incredible parts of his military career happened during the French Revolutionary Wars. The revolution had overturned the monarchy, and France was battling countries across Europe who wanted to restore the king. Dumas led thousands of soldiers into battle and often fought at the very front. He believed in leading by example. Once, he even captured a whole enemy garrison by himself. Stories like that may sound like legend, but they're documented in military records. He commanded the cavalry and was responsible for hundreds of daring raids and brilliant victories. In one campaign in the Alps, Dumas led his troops through deep snow and treacherous terrain to surprise and defeat a much larger enemy force. Soldiers who served under him said he had the strength of 10 men and the courage of 100. He was over 6 feet tall, a giant in that era, and cut an imposing figure on horseback. But despite his success, Dumas often faced racism and resentment. In revolutionary France, mixed-race people had a strange place. The revolution had declared that all men are equal, but this ideal was not always lived out. Mixed-race people, especially those with noble connections like Dumas, were often treated better than fully black individuals. Still, they were never fully accepted. Dumas constantly had to prove himself in a world that did not know what to make of a black general. His relationship with Napoleon Bonaparte was complex. At first, they admired each other. Napoleon was a rising star, and Dumas was a celebrated general. They even served together on a campaign in Egypt. But over time, things soured. Dumas disagreed with Napoleon's authoritarian tendencies. He believed the revolution was about liberty and justice, not about replacing one ruler with another. He spoke out against Napoleon's growing power. Napoleon didn't forget that. When Dumas tried to return to France from Egypt, his ship was wrecked in a storm, and he was captured by enemies in Italy. He spent 2 years in a dungeon, sick and starving. The French government, now under Napoleon, made no effort to rescue him. When he finally returned home, he was broken in health and spirit. He applied for a pension, a common reward for generals, but was denied. Another part of Dumas' story that few people know is his commitment to ending slavery. He was outspoken about the rights of all people, not just French citizens. He believed that the revolution's ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, should apply to everyone. This was controversial. Napoleon, who reinstated slavery in the colonies after it had been abolished, likely saw Dumas as a threat to his policies. Dumas also clashed with military officers who held racist views. He insisted that soldiers be judged by their courage and skill, not their skin color. His leadership inspired thousands, including many who had never seen a black man in a position of power. He proved that excellence had no color. Back in France, Dumas married Marie-Louise Labouré, the daughter of an innkeeper. Together, they had a son, Alexandre. The boy would grow up hearing stories about his father's heroics, and those tales would fill his imagination. One day, he would become a writer, telling tales of sword fights and noble battles in books like The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo. What few people realize is that many of the adventures in those novels were based on real events from his father's life. Thomas Alexandre Dumas died in 1806, nearly forgotten by the country he had risked his life to defend. But he never stopped believing in justice. He died poor, sick, and betrayed, but never defeated. His courage lived on in his son, and now, in the stories we tell. In 2002, nearly 200 years after his death, the French government finally recognized his contributions. His remains were reinterred in the Pantheon in Paris, a place reserved for France's greatest heroes. Thanks for listening to Bedtime History. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing and leaving a gentle thumbs up. We'll be back soon with another peaceful journey through time. Good night. Hi there, and welcome to Bedtime History. If you enjoy relaxing stories about incredible people from the past, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring you more peaceful, fascinating tales to fall asleep to. Now, take a deep breath, get cozy, and let's journey back in time. Tonight's story is about a man often called the father of modern Russian literature. A poet, a rebel, and a romantic, he lived boldly and left behind words that still stir hearts nearly 2 centuries later. This is the story of Alexander Pushkin. Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin was born in Moscow in 1799 into a family of nobility, but his bloodline carried something even more remarkable. On his mother's side, he descended from Abram Ganable, an African-born general who had been kidnapped as a child, brought to Russia, and raised in the court of Peter the Great. Abram was educated, noble, and fiercely intelligent, and he became one of Russia's most celebrated military engineers. Pushkin always knew that part of his heritage, and he was proud of it. He would later write a poem about Abram, calling him the Moor of Peter the Great. As a child, Pushkin was bright but restless. He wasn't always well-behaved, but he had a sharp mind and a love for stories. He read everything he could get his hands on: Shakespeare, Voltaire, Byron. His French tutor said he was a little volcano. By age 12, Pushkin was accepted into the Imperial Lyceum in Tsarskoye Selo, a school for the sons of the nobility. There, away from home, he began writing poetry. His early verses were filled with wit, rhythm, and daring ideas. He had a way of making the Russian language sound musical and fresh. Before he even graduated, critics and scholars were praising his talent. But Pushkin wasn't just a poet. He had a spirit that could not be tamed. He believed in liberty. He believed in speaking truth to power. And in a country ruled by an autocratic czar, that was dangerous. Some of his early poems were banned. He was exiled from the capital. The government sent him to live far from St. Petersburg, first in the south and then in other corners of the empire. But Pushkin turned exile into inspiration. He wrote some of his most beautiful and enduring work during those years. Poems about love, nature, justice, and the soul. He roamed the Crimea. He watched the sea. He wrote about ancient ruins and broken empires. And all the while, he never stopped challenging authority. Pushkin had an amazing gift. He could blend personal emotion with national identity. He wrote love poems that felt like confessions and political verses that felt like revolutions. One of his most famous works is a verse novel called Eugene Onegin. It tells the story of a bored aristocrat, a passionate young woman, and the quiet tragedy of missed opportunities. It is written entirely in rhyme, with elegance and melancholy. It changed Russian literature forever. But Pushkin also wrote fairy tales, stories filled with magical fish, golden cockerels, and greedy czars. He believed literature should be for everyone, not just the elite. Despite his growing fame, Pushkin was never completely safe. He was watched by the secret police. His letters were read. His books were censored. The Tsar himself demanded to approve his manuscripts before publication. Pushkin lived under constant scrutiny, but he kept writing. He also fell deeply in love. Her name was Natalia Goncharova. She was young, graceful, and stunningly beautiful. Pushkin courted her for years before they married. He was captivated by her, proud to walk with her through crowded salons. But her beauty attracted attention, sometimes the wrong kind. A French officer named Georges Dantes began to pursue Natalia. Rumors swirled. Pushkin, proud and impulsive, could not bear the gossip. He challenged Dantes to a duel. On a cold winter evening in 1837, Pushkin stood in the snow with pistol in hand. He was 37 years old. The duel ended with Pushkin gravely wounded. He was taken home and died 2 days later. All of Russia mourned. They wept not just for the poet, but for the voice he had become. In his short life, Pushkin wrote over 800 lyrical poems, 12 verse novels, 7 dramas, and dozens of stories and fairy tales. His words shaped the Russian language. He gave a voice to its rhythms, its passion, and its soul. He once said, "Inspiration is needed in geometry just as much as in poetry." Even as he fought censorship, exile, and prejudice, Pushkin continued to believe in the power of beauty and truth. He made the Russian language sing. He turned his struggles into art. And he left behind a legacy that still whispers to us, like a lullaby from another time. Pause. Thanks for listening to Bedtime History. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing and leaving a gentle thumbs up. We'll be back soon with another peaceful journey through time. Good night.